Hey everybody, ready for another talk. Once again, I want to thank our sponsors. Feedback again, BSidesSF.com/feedback. If you have session feedback, go on the schedule. There's a feedback survey button. There's still a raffle left at the end of the day for a $150 Amazon gift card, courtesy of Gemalto, so please put your name on that. There may or may not be any t-shirts left. You can go check and see. Otherwise, this is John Bambenek and Hardik Modi of Fidelis Cybersecurity going to present our next talk.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It's like the second to last talk of the conference, so I know like many of you are tired or whatever. So I thought we'd do something like really technical that might get you all, kind of engaged in talking about writing device drivers with JavaScript. It's a really good idea. And how many people actually believe this is my topic, right? Okay, there's one person, right? Just a sense of humor check here. So our talk is about sucker punching malware, specifically using malware design flaws or design decisions as both defense and offense against attackers. I'm going to one particular case study with JSocket and some stuff that we've done in the past, right? So a little bit about who we are, right? My name is John Bambenek. I manage the threat systems team at Fidelis Cybersecurity. Hardik here is my boss, vice president of threat research. Right? It sounds impressive, right? But he's made two bad decisions since I've known him. One, he hired me, and two, he promoted me. So maybe not so impressive after all, right? So why sucker punching malware, right? For those of you who get the reference, right? Show me your cyber war face, right? There's something satisfying about doing something more than detecting threats. It comes down to the deck is stacked against us defenders, right? The attackers have more tools, the economics favor them, and the time for us to respond is much higher than the time it is for them to respond and adapt, right? We detect, we write rules, deploy those technologies, watch for telemetry. That is a time-consuming process versus putting a new binary in the field is a very short process. Takedowns and prosecutions are time-consuming endeavors. For the two prosecutions I've done in the last 2 years, have been part of, it averages about 8 months from me getting involved to somebody being arrested, right? And there is no way to scale that response. So again, deck is stacked against us. But really what gets fun is getting inside the action cycle of the adversary, right? Is getting inside their head and treating it like a frat house. So a little bit about OODA loops. The Symmetria talk yesterday talked a little bit about that. It's observe, orient, detect, act, and it's the mental cycle people do in adversarial situations, right? They see something that the new data point, new adversary, somebody engaging in new behavior, right? Orient themselves to that reality, decide on a course of action, and then act, right? If you can get inside that loop, that mental process, it creates a de facto destabilizing factor, for your adversary. So the key is, right, is to act in a way that's faster than those adversaries. So when we talk about sucker punching, and this has collapsed a little bit from a longer talk because we only got 30 minutes, right? But ultimately, in terms of sucker punching, you could block IP addresses, take domain names, simple stuff, right? Level 1. Level 2, you've got peer-to-peer networks for command and control, which attackers like because it gives them resiliency, but they lose authentication. So if you can poison a peer-to-peer command and control network, you could take over or disable a botnet. Compromised websites, for instance. Dridex, 3 weeks ago, somebody took over a compromised website that was used by Dridex to deliver a Avira antivirus instead of malware. All right, that's a good little disruptive tactic, not very persistent, but, that's level 2. But level 3, which we'll be talking about in our case study, is figuring out those things that really matter to an adversary. What is their single point of weakness, pain, pressure, whatever, and use that against them, finding some other way to flip the tables on them, right? But ultimately, like I said, the goal is to live rent-free inside their head and treat it like a frat house. Yeah.
So, a lot of this is just like the exploitation process for legitimate software that many of us here, end up creating. Malware finally is just software based on something that a human being has created. it ends up with design flaws. There are objectives for the author of the malware that they're trying to meet that then leaves them exposed. Okay, we did the JavaScript kind of case, and that, of course, that developer needs help. But, even for somebody writing malware, especially in the remote access Trojan rat scenarios that we're talking about, there's a lot of just corners that have to be cut or are often cut that then, open up sort of opportunities for people like us. Any product managers here? I'm sure there are lots of software developers here. I'm sure there are a lot of software developers who've worked with product managers, and you gotta hate those fucking product managers. And, I used to be one not too long ago, so I speak from experience. But, at the end of the day, what is somebody doing when they're writing software, right? They're building requirements. The developers are writing the software. They're testing the software. Hopefully they're deploying it. Eventually, they get to that stage. They get feedback. They do support. All of this process that, your average software developer follows, in a software development house is what the malware developer ends up doing. And so, this is where we get opportunities to observe, what are they actually trying to do? And then how do we end up, getting in the middle of that? So, we're going to talk a little bit about Alien Spy. This was, this is, just, an iteration of, a multi-generation rat tool. We're going to then talk about JSocket, some of the stuff that's happened recently. Alien Spy in some form or the other has been around since at least 2012. And originally with Adwind and Fruta's rat, with those, the earlier, incarnations, there were some fairly significant, compromises in the Middle East that had been reported, using those tools. And, the tools originally were essentially distributed for free. A special characteristic of these tools is that they're all jar, they're all Java-based tools. And so what happened was, a lot of people realized fairly early on that your classic spam filter knows to look for executable files, for binary files, but not necessarily for jar files. And so this became this really neat way of just bypassing a lot of email protection to get to a user. And then, of course, the hapless user that installs a malware is then owned. Now, along the way, they realized that there was a lot going on. A lot of people were profiting, and they wanted to be in on the value capture. And so it went commercial somewhere along the way. Our first engagement with Alien Spy, with this kind of succession of rats was in 2014, and that was when we wrote a paper on something called Unrecom Rat, a successor to Adwind and Fruta's. And just within a few weeks of our publishing that paper, alienspy.net was registered. And that's really where our story begins, the story that we want to tell you about today. So then if you just step back and think about the challenges of selling rats, you're selling rats to people with malicious intent. They're not, these aren't like your average users of software, or your average users of software. Many of us will attest to them doing, kind of stupid stuff and malicious stuff. But in this case, you are absolutely selling your package to somebody who has essentially criminal intent. So they're scoundrels, right? They install, if they bought the package from you, they're going to install it in multiple systems. They're going to provide it to their friends. Some number of them might actually just go ahead and post it to a forum, share it with lots of different people. Okay, even if you ignore all that, just selling a rat means you're always doing updates. You find that lots of systems, doesn't install on certain systems, doesn't work as well elsewhere. So you're updating your software, you're providing support, you might be running chat forums. Some people are known to run entire, fairly elaborate forums in Facebook, on Facebook, providing support to users of rats. And also along the way, other people show up who just are like value-added resellers. They're essentially just taking the package that you're distributing and making it available on their site for what could be a significant markup. Again, something that as an author, you'd be, why is somebody else capturing that value? And then finally, us on the defense side, we figure out how to detect command and control. We write signatures and we go catch, campaigns in action. So if you were the author, what would you do, right? You do what pretty much every software development shop ends up doing some amount of licensing control, some amount of installation control. Where you can, you use TLS. And this is something I really want to emphasize, that doing this then opens up these exposures that we later got to exploit. So then, we think of Alien Spy in particular as a rat net. And this is like, totally akin to a botnet. There's the person who is writing the software, who is publishing new malware, who is making it available on a site, in this case, alienspy.net. Eventually, there are lots of people buying the package and using it for their purposes, and what they're essentially buying is the panel, and the panel is what they get to install on their systems. That's where they generate malware. The package the malware that is generated, they try to deliver to victims, get them to install, and eventually, one might assume that every buyer of the software is going to have multiple victims. There's a lot of TLS. Well, mainly we observed in Alien Spy between the victim and the panel. All of that was like a self-signed certificate. John will talk a little bit about that. So then you look at this whole network, and then you observe, maybe there is a single point of failure. And this is essentially what happened. And last year, we got to take part in this. Alien Spy was taken down, essentially in one swoop. And I'll explain how we got to that. We published our paper on Alien Spy the 8th of April, 2015. I have to tell you guys, we were General Dynamics Fidelis security systems at that time. That General Dynamics does not like doing this stuff. Doesn't like getting involved, doesn't like getting their name in the paper. So all we did was publish a paper. There was no action that we took, on our part. But somebody at GoDaddy happened to read the paper and decided, this domain doesn't really belong to the malware creators. And so they suspended the domain essentially 2 days later. And the effect of this, just as soon as they did that, the effect of this was that now that the domain is gone, they couldn't sell new panels. All of the chat rooms were hosted at alienspy.net. So at that point, all these users who are either talking to each other or talking to the author, asking questions, discussing best practices, I'm sure, all of them suddenly had nowhere to talk, about these things and had to go find other ways to regroup. But more importantly, everybody who had a panel was connecting back to alienspy.net for authentication and licensing. So every panel went down, and as a result, they could not generate any new malware, and every existing campaign, because the panel was down, if you were a victim and you were connecting back to somebody who was running a panel, well, that guy's panel is down. Your network is down. You're no longer, under their control. So, with this, in this network, taking down alienspy.net had this, fairly large impact. Just like that. Now, along the way, Alien Spy, the story got a little bit richer. Well, it got richer for those of us on the research side. But it turned out that there was an Argentinian prosecutor who had been, Alberto Nisman, who had been about to, or was in the process of filing a case against the Argentinian government related to, the cover-up, alleged cover-up of a bombing in Buenos Aires that happened in 1992. Again, allegedly Hezbollah that did it. And, there's this really murky story around Alberto Nisman and his death. Essentially, I think it was like January 2015. So before we got around to publishing what we did. And then later in the summer, it was revealed that, at the time of his death, he had Alien Spy installed, what was originally said to be his mobile phone, but, in later analysis, was more likely to have been his laptop. Again, no, this is, potentially complete coincidence, but, Citizen Lab, and, a few others felt that there was a fairly significant kind of connection here. So this emerged later. Of course, by the time that we found this out, Alien Spy was gone. So you might ask, is that the end of the story? And, the answer is not really.
So here's the part where we get to have a little bit of, at least I got to have a little bit of fun, right? We write our detection rules. We're a security vendor. We detect things, but old rules never really die. They kind of just sit around for a while. There's zero traffic, and all of a sudden we start seeing traffic, on Alien Spy again. It's like, this is gone. What's going on, right? Because he carried over some of the artifacts that we'll talk about that made him vulnerable the first time, and it was used to much greater effect the second time. So roughly 2.5 months after the Alien Spy takedown, jsocket.org is registered. Same kind of mechanism, right? You've got a subscription server where you download the C2, you pay over Bitcoin or the various web money and underground payment systems. But most of the code stayed the same, and most of the artifacts we'll talk in great detail, right? Still thing, Java-based, multi-platform, has an Android component. It had one in Alien Spy. And the unfortunate reality of the Alien Spy takedown is I was about to start doing the research on the Android component, and then everything went dark and I couldn't do any research, so I was kind of bummed about that. But jsocket.org kind of provided a component to say, all right, now I've got some time to actually research the Android part of this, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Kaspersky estimates that this author has made about $200,000 in about a year and a half of operation, so not a bad living of putatively tax-free money. So certainly a fair market for these kind of tools, and it did provide a good niche. I mean, multi-platform, Mac, Linux, Windows, the functions were tailored for the underlying operating system. So it certainly provided a good tool for use in criminal stuff. We saw actors using it for criminal motivation to load financial malware. Script kiddies may have used it, and certainly higher level intelligence agency related organizations, right? The binary itself is kind of highly obfuscated, using allotory and some encryption, right? And they want to prevent, and they used SSL TLS in a way that made interception of the traffic difficult, right? As was mentioned, this project with this author started more as a freeware tool, right? He kind of gave it away and then realized, hey, you know what? I could be making cashy money with this. Why am I giving it away? And that was what he started with Adwind, which was 3 or 4 iterations back. Well, somebody had cracked it and then started distributing it for free. And that became the psychological motivation he used to start enforcing, a subscription system to make sure he kept capturing that money. That was an intentional design choice he made, which undermined him both in Alien Spy and JSOCKET. And we'll talk about that in a second, right? And just as a bit of human intelligence, the author tends to frequent a Spanish-speaking forum, Indetectables. I think I'm pronouncing that right, or indetectables.net. So not really great OPSEC on his part to enumerate, his actual identity and see kind of the organization he had, which was relatively flat. So talk a little bit about the architecture, and we saw it on the earlier side with Alien Spy, that graphic. You had a subscription server that basically provided encryption keys and file structure and other information. There was a routine heartbeat of all the C2 panels saying, hey, am I still valid? Yes, you are, right? If that ever failed for any reason, right, the panel would close. That's it. You can't communicate with your victims. But they did something interesting, is that they were doing certificate pinning, where the actual certificate of jsocket.org and the IP address of the DNS name were hard-coded into the builders. So if there were any changes whatsoever, the builder would change. The builder would fail to start, or it would close. Again, he wants to verify he's getting the money, but he also wants to limit the amount of surveillance that we can do. So some of my usual tricks of getting around that, system call tracing doesn't work in Java, so I couldn't get easily into the cycle to see exactly how the API worked, because he really wants to avoid people kind of creating cracked versions. Okay? The certificate details in the builder itself were interesting. This was something that was created as part of JSOCKET, is that he also did certificate pinning between the C2 panel and the victim. So if there was something in the middle between the victim and the C2, right, it would also fail, the malware would fail to launch, right? And you see this, the certificate details behind me, Acilius, right? Oddly specific things. From an intelligence perspective, I love free-form text fields, because it is very, very hard to put anything in a free-form text field that I can't model and attribute. So just doing a quick rudimentary Google search, I find this page, which probably doesn't show up very particularly well, but AciliusWordPress.com is instructions of how to create a Java key store and a certificate. He basically followed these things step by step, saying, I'm going to do this with this CN, with this country code. He even used the same Java key store password in Alien Spy of StorePass, which means you can manipulate the key store and defeat his mechanisms. He did learn a little bit about encryption to change that password as time went on. But now Inola says, you know what, he doesn't really know much about encryption or SSL. He's just following instructions that he finds on the web, which lets me know something a little bit more about him. He wants to focus on his Java, not on his security. So the implications of this, right? No SSL, man in the middle, works, right? You can't get in the middle of the traffic. But on the flip side, right, if there's something in the middle, just a web proxy that breaks SSL, right, the malware would never fire, right? So it's a built-in defense, and he didn't really care that he had less victims because he was really focused on, one, preventing us from detecting and monitoring him, and two, from people creating cracked versions of his software, right? So identical copy-pasted steps from that last website, that he used, which lets me know how he built it and how he could technically defeat it, right? Now, a little bit about Android, too, right? Because I was able to sit there and get into Android. Similar thing with APKs is that you need to sign an Android application with a signing certificate, right? And the builder uses the same signing certificate across all versions, right? Which, again, provides that detection mechanisms across versions, across families, that allows us to detect them over time. So when he came back on the radar, we were able to see them, right? So this made these APKs very easy to find if you were doing certificate-based, looking for particular attributes. Even if you were uploading them to the Play Store. I mean, usually the model for malicious APKs is some kind of social engineering to get somebody, hey, install this, change the settings on their phone, but there was a small window of which to get this into the Play Store, all right? So there will be some more forms of this, right? As builders for APK malware happens, is managing the certificates. It'll be a very difficult thing for the attacker to do, but looking for those attributes certainly, will make it easier to detect malicious APKs. So something to keep track of more than just in this narrow case of Java. So, as an official saying, I'm not saying, there was any JSocket APKs actually in the Google Play Store, except that there were, and they were removed, right? So, based on indications of findings. So people are using these, known certs, sign the things, upload it to the Play Store. So now there's a little bit more knowledge to prevent that kind of mechanism from happening. The last mental psychological aspect I want to talk about is that the author himself really didn't like a whole lot of attention, right? He was aggravated about our Alien Spy post. He's been aggravated about several things that are keeping track of him. If you look at that forum in Detectables, you will see him using the account, the username Adwind, to say, hey, I'm no longer involved with this, and this is some cracked version, kind of creating some rudimentary, plausible deniability, right? He didn't like the attention that he was under, and this was creating some difficulties for him, and hopefully will create some more difficulties going forward. But one aspect of that attention is that there is an individual, Kevin Breen, out of the United Kingdom. He creates a lot of open source malware decoders that lets you just statically rip configuration items out of malware. It is a great tool set. I encourage you all that if you're interested in these things, take a look at. But this particular actor knew that Kevin Breen was doing this, and he started rotating encryption keys in the actual dropped binaries that was provided by jsocket.org. Many iterations of those were actually homophobic slurs addressed at Kevin Breen. So he knew who Kevin Breen was mocking him by name, and aggravated, and doing steps to try to get around the decoding process. But the reality is that he created some difficulties for himself, right? That central server controlled everything. So we had a little bit of fun with him, right? jsocket.org originally was on a shared hosting box. Okay. Well, what could go wrong in a shared hosting environment is that I was simply able to pay the hosting provider a premium, give me an account on that box, right? And in one of my papers, I put in a reference to Operation Biscuit Eater, right? A very directed message to him that if you went to operationbiscuiteater.org or .com, right, you'd see this message. Once he figured out the reference, which was in about 24 to 36 hours, he immediately moved from that share hosting box to a dedicated box, but had to reship all of his binaries because the IP address was hard-coded in there so that none of the builders would work. He would have to redistribute again. And that poor user experience was creating downward pressure on his economics, right? So fast forward today. 2 weeks ago, Kaspersky SAS, some researchers post a great more deal about jsocket.org, right? And the malware behind it. And not really being happy with the increasing level of what was going on, he had burned down jsocket.org, his server, everything, and just went to ground, right? So you probably can't see this, right? But this is, again, the thread on indetectables.net from 2 days ago talking about, hey, where did this guy go? Some people say he went to Brazil on the beach. He's enjoying his 200 grand, whatever he's doing, but very clear that this guy disappeared very, very quickly. So what did we learn, of how to do this, right? This TLS pinning, right? It creates a mechanism to authenticate the server, right? I know I'm talking to the server because the certificate matches, it was signed. Great. Nothing can be manipulated there, except that if you do SSL man in the middle, right, in a proper environment, you would be doing that. No victims will be talking. But if you created any pressure on the jsocket.org also, it would take it all down with you, right? So focusing on that subscription server allowed us to kill all C2s with one particular shot. And knowing his paranoias, let me get inside of his head and have a little bit of fun, right? It takes a long time to prosecute somebody, but you can troll somebody fairly quickly, right? So final note, I do run a lot of private intel sharing groups on specific threats, exploit kits, DDoS, so long, with people all over the industry. If you're interested in participating in some of these operations, let me know. We all work for our own companies, but I don't really care about that. I care about people with talent looking to tackle the problem. So if you're interested in joining, find us. More of our research, threatgeek.com. You find us on Twitter. Any questions?
Someone's got a question. Come on.
Come on, it's the second to last talk. Somebody's still here with a pulse.
We can take questions offline if we need to.
Oh,
but I just
right.
want to, so we want to thank the speakers again. Appreciate them. And again, on behalf of
Thank you.